are the practice bias questions, and I'm going to go over what the answers are for each of them. And if you have any questions, please let me know, and I will do my best to make it perfectly clear what the right answer is and why. So question 1, which of the following best describes how bias can be found in test scores? A, test scores will show that different groups have overall different average scores. B, test scores will show that there is a random difference between someone's true score and their observed score. C, people in one group consistently perform better than those in another group even though they have exactly the same ability. And D, people with greater ability consistently perform better than people with lesser ability. Well, A isn't right because different groups are probably going to have different scores, right? It'd be ridiculous if everyone was exactly the same across every way we could group them. That just isn't going to happen. So A isn't right. B, where you have test scores showing a random difference, is incorrect because, as we stated, bias is a systematic difference, right? Not a random difference. Random error is always involved and is always going to contribute to the difference between somebody's observed score and their true score, but that's not bias. C, people in one group consistently perform better than those in another group even though they have exactly the same ability is the right answer, because if we have the same ability, sometimes you should do better than I do, sometimes I should do better than you do, and overall we should be about the same. But if you are always doing better than me even though we have the same ability, well, then something's going on, and I have the systematic error I was talking about. D isn't correct because people with greater ability should perform better than people with lesser ability. That's not bias. That's just a good assessment, right? We want people who are better at something to score higher on an assessment than people who aren't as good. So question 2, Sam the Sham McManus creates a social studies test for 7th graders. Unbeknownst to him, his test defends the girls in his class such that the test scores are an average of 10 points below their true ability. However, the test also uses examples that privileges them so that they gain their 10 points back on the average. Which of the following statements is most accurate? I have A, the test items are biased but the test scores are not. B, the test items and the test scores are biased. C, the test scores are biased, but the test items are not. And D, neither the test items nor the test scores are biased. Well, it's not D because I'm telling you things are biased in there, right? The question really is it the items, the scores, or both? Well, I am telling you that items are biased, that they get 10 points and they lose 10 points, right, on different items because of bias. So the items have to be biased. The main question is whether or not the scores are biased. Well, if on the average, right, they gain 10 points but they lose 10 points, that means that on the average, their observed score should be the same as their true score, meaning that because I don't have an error, I don't have bias. Now, this is one that most people find difficult to think about, but I want you to kind of confine your level or your focus of analysis on just this idea of what bias is. And in order for there to be bias in test scores, there needs to be a systematic difference or systematic distortion of the truth. In this case, when I look at that end result, right, their overall score, and that's what we're talking about here, there is no systematic distortion, and therefore those scores aren't biased. 3, which of the following situations are completely bias-free? A, if everyone's performance on an assessment perfectly reflects their ability. B, if everyone scores the same. C, if minority students outperform majority students. Or D, bias can exist in all the situations described above. Now, one of the things that people usually think about when we talk about this in class is that, well, bias can exist in almost any situation, so it's got to be D. And I'm going to say that D is not the right answer. Because while in reality, bias can always be around, and we can never be 100% sure that we got rid of it, if we knew that everyone's score in an assessment was their true score, right? So in other words, if everyone's performance on an assessment perfectly reflects their ability, that means the difference between their true score and their observed score is 0. and that's how everybody scores, well, then there is no bias because there's no distortion. Again, everybody's getting exactly what they deserve, and so I cannot have bias in that situation. Can I ever know if this happens in the real world? No, because we can't know true scores in the world. But if we could, and we had a situation like A, we would find that there is no particular distortion or bias in this situation. Number 4, if I have disparate results between boys and boys do worse than girls, I can certainly conclude that A, my tests are offensive to boys, B, my tests penalize boys, C, either A or B, or D, none of the above. Well, in this case, right, the key thing that we're trying to think of, is this a guarantee? If I see different results between boys and girls, is it a guarantee that some sort of assessment bias is occurring? And the answer to that is no, it's not. When I was in 8th grade, I was in a small school, and all the boys went out for the basketball team because there were only 12 of us in 8th grade, and we needed that really to have a full team. And it was kind of, I don't know, a solidarity sort of thing. Yeah, we're going to do great. And we were terrible. And we were often short-handed because most of the time half our team was not academically eligible. And I will say that in 8th grade that I was the only boy who was not kicked off for grades at one point because I maintained a C average or better. So, that's the standard. And I was the only one who apparently could do that. So not a great academic performance from the boys. If you looked at our test scores in any particular subject in 8th grade, there were 13 girls in my 8th grade class, and the average girl score was way better than the average boy score because they studied, they did their homework, paid attention in class, and they weren't always goofing around. They deserved better test scores. They deserved better grades because they knew more than the boys, right? So in that case, that was a perfect reflection of the real world and how it should have been. The girls should have done better, and there was no offensiveness, no penalization. So in any case, right, any classroom you're going to look at, the average ability between boys and girls is not likely to be the same for any particular content area. And so if you see that they score differently, that's not an indicator of bias. If you think that the boys are actually more skilled than the girls and they just keep performing worse on tests, that's not even a guarantee of bias either. Could just be a lack of effort or more anxiety or something like that. So bias is never guaranteed, and it's really hard to rule out though. But just because I have different results, it doesn't mean that anything weird is going on. Item 5. Class teacher Anita Hammer, I need a hammer, another one of my little names, finds that the boys in her classes tend to do better than the girls and concludes that her tests must be biased. To rectify this situation, she creates extra study resources for the girls and give them private extra lessons. She asks you for your advice as to whether she is doing enough. What would you tell her? Well, you could say A, you should wait and see if the test scores are even before deciding if she had eliminated the bias. You could B, tell her she should probably do a little more test coaching to make sure the girls know what to do. C, her initial tests may have not been biased in the first place, and she probably created bias by giving the girls extra resources. Or D, she should really give the girls and boys separate grades based on gender-specific averages. Well, just because there are differences doesn't mean we should have different averages, so D's out. A, you could say that she could wait, but you're kind of ignoring the fact that she is not giving everybody an equal education. She is not giving everybody the same testing conditions even. And the correct answer in this case is C, that her initial tests may not have been biased in the first place, and she probably created bias by giving the girls extra resources. Now, I'm not trying to be sexist here or anything like that, but it could be that boys do better in shop class just because this particular group of boys is more interested in stuff and working and building things and so on than the girls were. Not sure, probably different in a different class. But when I think of the typical shop class population, historically speaking, it's mostly guys, because guys typically, culturally, at least in America, are more interested in that sort of stuff. It's not to say that they're any more skilled, but they probably spend more time on it than girls do. At least that was true when I was growing up, and for most of the kids that I babysat, which ended about 15 years ago. So up until then, that was a pretty safe bet. Modifying instruction, modifying what people have access to during tests, introduces instructional and assessment bias, and so you should probably stay away from that. C is the best answer here. 6, which of the statements is true about bias? If an accountability test produces a statistically significant disparate impact between minority and majority performance for students, it is certain to possess assessment bias. This is the ACT example, and this is not true, right? Because there are differences in between minority and majority students. That is an artifact of our society, and the test should be sensitive to those sorts of things. Doesn't mean that the test has to be biased. Could it be? Maybe. But if they've tested it and said it's not, you can probably trust it isn't. And just because you see differences doesn't mean that bias is a guarantee. B, suppose a test is given to a class of students. On average, girls' observed scores are higher than their true score, and also, on average, the boys' observed score are lower than their true scores. This means that it's biased. This is also not true. It could be true. And if this happened consistently, then you could say that there was bias. But what we're missing in this situation is that consistent distortion. This is a distortion. But if I gave the next test to this class, I might find the opposite, right? That the boys on average scored a little bit better than they should have, and the girls on the average scored a little bit worse than they should have, for whatever reason. Guessing, distraction, time of the day, what was given for lunch, who knows, right? And so the idea here is that random error is one thing and bias is another. Bias is the systematic distortion. Random is just random error that happens all the time. And when I average across random errors, I'm never going to get exactly the truth. But it doesn't mean that if I have random errors, that I automatically have bias. C, if Bill scores consistently below his ability on exams, the tests he takes are biased against him. This is also not true, because maybe Bill just doesn't care and isn't trying. And I knew a lot of people like this in grade school and high school and even college, that you don't really care that much about your academics. You don't really try your hardest. Don't get that focused. Don't get that motivated for the tests. And you just kind of blow through them and hope for a D or a C, right? So that doesn't mean, so none of these statements are true. D is the correct answer. Finally, that brings us to number 7. Bill notices that girls always do better than boys in his classroom tests. His friend runs some analyses on his classroom tests and tells Bill that his tests are biased. Well, Bill decides to try and eliminate by making the test easier for the boys, which of course means it is relatively harder for the girls. And he asks your opinion. Which of the following statements would be a good response? Great job, Bill. That totally makes sense. It's not a good idea because you can't get rid of bias. See, that's not a good idea because your test might already be biased against the girls. Or D, all of the other responses are inaccurate. None of the above option. In this case, the best answer is C. Just because your friend or his friend runs some stats and says, yeah, your test is biased, he didn't say who it was biased towards. It could be that the gap between the boys and the girls should be bigger than it actually is. One of the ways, right, we can reduce tests or outcomes on tests and the differences we see in them is to hold the high performers down and inflate or raise the low performers up, right? I don't know why we would want to do that, but it seems like some people want to do that. What you are trying to do is always get an accurate representation of what the world is really like. And so in this case, it could be that the girls really should be performing 20 points better than the boys on the average, but because the test is biased against them, it's only a 10-point difference. So you have to understand that just because you have disparate impacts or disparate results on a test, and you see differences in groups, it doesn't mean automatically that the test is biased against the group that is performing lower. All it means is that there's bias. What you do need to do then is, if you ran some kind of differential item, then you could look at, for each level of ability, what is the difference, right? For people of average ability, do they perform the same? For people who are below average, do they perform the same? People who are above average, do they perform the same? And in that way, you could figure out whether or not it's, or who it's relatively easier or harder for, because you're controlling for ability. But if in this case, the girls have an ability that's much higher than what's being represented on the test, then you have a more complicated situation, and making the test easier for the boys is not going to help. It's going to make things worse. So I hope those answers make sense. If they don't, please let me know via email. I'll put up a discussion post again if you have any questions on bias.